it's fantastic. Judy Wajcman will be known to many of you. She is the editor of the canonical Social Shaping of Technology book with Don Mackenzie. She has written many books before and since. She has written about the social implications of technology. She is also a sociologist of work, which comes in handy for this topic today. She is professor of sociology at the LSE and has written this book, which we're discussing today.
And she's an associate of the OII.
And she's an associate, a friend of the OII, I should say.
And she has Anthony Giddens' chair.
Yes, she has a chair. And
And
chair.
a very nice chair
The
it is
chair.
too.
Right, and John Naughton is also a friend of the OII. He's also vice president of Wolfson College at the other place. He has been a visiting professor of the public understanding of technology at the Open University. And like Judy, he has published books about implications of technologies. And he writes the column in The Observer about things digital. They are going to have a conversation now. I'm going to get out of the way, but before that I'll just say a couple of housekeeping things. One is that after they're done having a conversation with each other, this whole event is being recorded. So if you ask questions, please be aware that you're on camera. And if you want to exit that particular way of enhancing your privacy, then you need to let us know. And there will be drinks and nibbles afterwards. We'll go for about an hour or an hour and a half or so. Judy will start with about 10 minutes or so about the book. John will engage her in conversation for about half an hour, and then we'll throw it open to the floor. Does that sound okay? Great, thanks very much. Welcome.
I'm just going to stand up for my 10 minutes, and it is only going to be 10 minutes. And just for those of you who haven't read the book. Anyway, I just wanted to start by saying that it's an absolute delight to be here to be speaking about the book, because in fact, in this very seminar room, some years ago, more years than I like to remember, I gave the very first talk on the book. I was just starting the book, and I came along, and a few people here sat around and gave me ideas and were very encouraging about the project. And these projects take a very long time, so it's lovely to be here and have it finished and out. It's, you know, I can hardly believe it, you know. So I just wanted to begin by saying that. So for my just very quick sort of summary, shorter than a TED Talk even. As Ralph said, I'm an economic sociologist and a sociologist of technology. I've been really interested for a long, long time in the relationship between technology and time. I was brought up on Marx and Braverman and the assembly line. I read when I was very young E.P. Thompson's famous essay about the role of clocks in disciplining workers with the rise of industrial capitalism. So I've always been interested in clocks, the technology of time, the fact that we've all got here today more or less on time. So I was really intrigued by the general claims that I think are everywhere, that somehow everyday life is speeding up, that we're living in an acceleration society, you know, that life is spinning ever faster. And whether it's high-speed trading or high-speed dating, that everything's on this sort of velocity trajectory. And everyone talks about how busy they are, how time pressured they are, how harried they are. And the other thing I think that is noticeable and notable is that there's also an assertion made all the time that technology itself, that innovation itself is accelerating. I mean, the number of times I hear about Moore's law and that we're in this accelerating technology. And what I think is interesting, and I guess the crucial link I wanted to talk about in the book, was the sort of causal link that's made between the acceleration of our everyday lives and the acceleration of technologies. Now, if you believe the gurus of Silicon Valley, this speed is going to make our lives much, much better. We're going to be able to do lots of things more quickly, simultaneously. You know, we'll all have our little bands on, various apps, personal assistants, and our lives will be made smooth, easy, very well time managed. There'll be a technological fix for everything, and that all these technologies will somehow free up time, that we're on this really good trajectory with these sort of time management apps. You know, on the other hand, I think it's really interesting that there's an avalanche of books, it seems like that to me, of books saying we're really in terrible shape now, that we can't think anymore, that we're distracted. There's loads of books on solutions to this, which is that we need a digital detox. I mean, in fact, I watched the lecture that Tim Wu, I think that's how you pronounce it, gave here a year or two ago, and I noticed that his theme was attention, you know, that interruptions are shocking and that the business asset of the 21st century is going to be attention. Now, what's interesting for me is that there's a popular literature about this, but there's also a lot of social theory that mirrors this rather negative take on what digitalization is doing to time. And I'm thinking here about Manuel Castells, Paul Virilio. I've got a whole list of people I sort of talk about in the book, but they're all talking about how we're entering a new sort of I-time, digital time, timeless time. I mean, there's lots of different versions of the annihilation of time that they're all talking about. And I think what's interesting is that all of these theorists somehow place technology as the driving force for this notion of a new temporality, that we're moving away from what they call industrial linear clock time to this new time of simultaneity, instantaneity, timeless time, yes, and that technologies are driving this, and this is very destructive. So what does a sociologist and a science and technology studies person like me do when faced with these sort of claims that I don't think are questioned often enough and thought critically enough about? Well, of course, I begin by arguing against a simple technological determinism, that somehow these technologies on their own are inexorably driving acceleration. And actually, if you think about it, the very same devices that we sort of grasp to help us manage time are the same devices that we blame for this acceleration, that we're in this sort of paradox the whole time. And what I argue is that we're not really hostages to the machine, of course, that we set the priorities and parameters of our lives, and that we use technologies the way we want to use them, that it isn't the technologies themselves that are driving these things. In other words, I argue that the contemporary imperative of speed is as much a cultural artifact as it is a technological one. The technologies reflect as much as shape society. And for those of you who are students here, you'll know that in science and technology studies, we talk about technologies as socio-material practices. We try and get away from this simple technology has impacts and try and think of technologies as actually social. And I think that leads you quickly to think about time as a socio-material practice. That in fact, the way we experience and think about time, the way we make time, is with tools and techniques. Okay, so I'm just now, with my last few minutes, going to list a few of the myths that I try and attack in the book, just to give you some, some fodder to think about. Okay, one of the first things I say is that we're not in an unprecedented period. You know, we think this is the first time that we felt acceleration, the annihilation of time, all of these things. I'm not a terribly good historian, but I did go back and read some history. And I mean, it is just so striking when you read about the telegraph or the railways or any of these technologies. You know, people are talking in such synergistic ways about the disorienting effect of the railways and speed and annihilation of time. So I think, and I mean, it's a problem with quite a lot of social science. I know Ralph, we will all agree on this, that a historical perspective gets left out such a lot. That this is talked about a bit in sociology as kind of presentism, but it's like, things have just happened now and there's no history. So I devote a chapter to that. Now, I'm not arguing that there aren't new technologies that are having huge impacts on us, and of course, that is the substance of the book, but I also try and stress that there's continuities, and that there's continuities both in terms of old technologies and the infrastructure that we currently live in, like electricity or, all of these technologies, but also that the sort of moral panics and the kind of euphoria and the despair also have a long history. Okay, next point. I argue against the notion that acceleration is somehow one universal, uniform process, and that we really need to think about technologies as multiple, that we live in multiple technologies, in multiple times. And I think if you think about our own everyday experiences, it's clear that actually that we feel very different textures and intensity of time depending on, what we're doing, who we're doing it with, what the kind of context is. And the example I like to use is that of quality time with children. I mean, if you read these popular books, you would think we're in this terrible state with children plugged into their machines. I'm someone who uses a lot of time use data, and the time use data shows that in the last 40 years, the amount of time fathers and mothers spend with their children has actually increased. And it's not only increased, but the time of playing and talking has absolutely increased. And so one of the things that's never mentioned in these discussions, it seems to me, is really what you might think of as the intensification of parenting, that's a new thing. And I've written a lot about the mobile phone and done a lot of research on the mobile phone. And in that context, I have written about the mobile phone as a tool of intimacy, that actually, in order to organise this time, dual earner families in complicated work schedules, use the phone as a very important tool to make space for this quality time with kids. And so what I conclude from many such examples is that really the relationship between technology and time is dialectical, that it isn't all in one direction of speed, that actually some things may be going faster, but some things may be slowing down. And I think one has to look in detail at how the two things interact. Okay. So just to sort of sum that up, I've argued that we're not passive victims of technology, and that this obsession with speed is a cultural artefact as much as a technological artefact. Now, all I want to say for the rest of my time, the other point I want to make is that it seems to me that where we've totally bought this story about speed is in terms of thinking about technologies themselves, in thinking about the rate of technological innovation, that we seem to think that the fastest technology is the best technology, that the fastest technology, the technology that's the most automated, that is the speediest, is somehow going to deliver progress. And I think that we're so immersed in a culture of hyper-productivity and busyness that it's very hard really to step back and think about what kinds of technologies actually do we want? What values do we want them to serve? I mean, I really think we need to redefine what we mean by inventiveness and not just take the dominant story that somehow inventiveness is about speed. So to conclude, if we feel pressed for time today, it's not because of technology, but because of the priorities and parameters we set ourselves. Digital time is no different from any other time. I think we have to understand it as a product of the technologies that we interact with, we use, we domesticate, we integrate into our everyday lives, and that we actually build. And that if we want to take more control of time, I think we need to contest this imperative of speed and, importantly, democratise engineering, get much more engaged with actually building the world in which we live. I think at the moment we're leaving it too much to Silicon Valley and other people to define what the future is, what our aspirations can be, and I think we need to be sort of more engaged with this. And obviously the OII is a perfect place in which to do this. Thank you. We've got 10 minutes.
Thank you, Judy, and welcome, folks. I want to start by doing some audience research, please. How many of you feel that you are pressed for time? Okay. Okay, you're kind of standard intellectuals, broadly speaking. And I say that coming from Cambridge, so that's quite a compliment. Okay, so we're starting there. Now, first of all, I'm very pleased to be here. I love this institute, and I'm delighted to see it thriving. But I'm particularly glad to be here because of being asked to talk about Judy's book. I was sent a pre-press copy of it, which I read with open-mouthed amazement, because I read a lot of sociology, and most of it is written with screwdrivers. this is clear, it's delightfully written, it's not laden with jargon, it's scholarly at the same time, and so on. So it's a real pleasure to read. So from that point of view, I was delighted to be asked to do this. But particularly because what I most liked about the book was the way in which you contest what I think is becoming, first of all, it is a dominant narrative, and I think, in my opinion, a pernicious one. And the dominant narrative is the one where it's a deterministic narrative driven from a small, relatively small group of elites in a very curious part of the United States, essentially. And one of the things I do is I write a newspaper column, and I spend a lot of my time either ridiculing it or laughing at it or contesting it in some way. But it also needs to be contested in a serious way by the academy. And one of the disciplines that I think can do that best is that of sociology. And therefore, I think there's a real responsibility on sociologists to be able to communicate. And I don't think that many of them meet that requirement. They can communicate, of course, with their peers, but they can't connect with people, with electorates, as it were. Okay? And that's what's lovely about the book, in my opinion, is that. It's an example of an academic functioning as a proper public intellectual, and I really love that. So that's now what I want to talk about first is some things that you do bring out in the book, which is the fact that this dominant narrative, this technological deterministic narrative that you get from Silicon Valley, and the people who work in it, and the people who invest in them, and then the people who write admiringly about them in the mainstream media and so on. It's ideologically loaded in all kinds of ways, which I think we have talked about before in other ways. For example, most of the world is not in this trap, this time pressure that we feel here, because actually most of the world doesn't have the luxury of having those kinds of problems. And it leads me to think sometimes that one of my objections to the technology industry as a whole is that it's essentially characterized by a very small elite of socially dysfunctional people trying to solve the problems that they have and thinking that somehow they're doing some good for the world. That's a skeptical and rather hostile view of it, but that's essentially it. And in doing so, they have succeeded in persuading us that some of the things that they're working on are actually things that are really good for humanity, or that they're dealing with problems that real people actually have. And I don't think that's the case. For example, a lot of people in the world don't suffer from the difficulties that we have. They are time rich and cash poor. Mm. They're not. It's not the other way around, which is the kind of classic problem of the Silicon Valley narrative. So, from that point of view, I think that's one of the dimensions of the narrative that makes me very makes me very suspicious. Another one is that there are issues about assumptions about gender dominance in it. There are economic inequality figures in it. And there's a strange thing which you have brought out elsewhere, I think, which is the way in which somehow this narrative idolizes a certain way of being, which is a kind of bipolar mania. In other words, the people who are high status in these industries are people who have no normal social life, who work asleep under their desks, and they eventually cash out and become fabulously rich or whatever. But it's a very strange subset of humanity. And to find ourselves being, as it were, dominated by that kind of narrative seems to me to be crazy, which is why I'm pleased that you've taken it on.
Can I just elaborate on that?
Please do.
I mean, I was, we were sort of having a public discussion recently, and I had just read this book I thought was wonderful by a New York anthropologist called Emily Martin on bipolar, on being bipolar. And she's a fantastic anthropologist and has done a lot of field work on people doing this and the history of and the definition of it. You know, she's an STS person. And what I found very interesting about it is that she talks about how actually being manic and frenetic has been revalued in the contemporary world. That in fact she says that the kind of temperature, that the normal sort of emotional temperature that is considered normal, you know, because all these things are socially constructed, mental health and moods, and there are all these measures now on the internet where you can measure how often how your mood is and all of these things. She says that the temperature's actually been raised, and that it is interesting that there are these characters like Steve Jobs and various other of these entrepreneurial heroes who are characterized as being the most productive, creative, innovative people, you know, the models kind of thing. And what's idealized there is the frenetic, manic state, the 24/7 Silicon Valley, working all the time, not having a normal life state. And so I found it quite interesting how she sort of says that somehow ideologically this is kind of getting a resonance. And she found even amongst these groups of people that she spoke to, some of the people who suffered from this terrible condition actually were sort of soothed by the fact that, you know, they were a bit legitimated by this representation of these figures as having a mental state that one would aspire to. So it was an unusual sort of take on the discussion, I thought.
Yeah, I agree. And then there's another aspect of it, which is the absurdly narrow definition of technology. I mean, it becomes abbreviated to tech in for example, in the newspapers that I write for and the rest of it. So tech means one thing. It means actually IT, ICT, and it means technology as things. And I think that's a very impoverished view of technology. And implicit in your approach is a non-impoverished view of it. I think it was Heidegger had this thing where he said technology is the art of arranging the world so you don't have to experience it. Okay. But the thing that I challenge most about it is that technology is actually only incidentally about kit, about machinery, about hardware, and about software and so on. I would say a much better definition of technology is that it is the process of applying scientific and other organized knowledge to practical tasks by organizations. That's what it's about. And the actual machine bit of it, the technology bit of it, is actually quite the smallest bit, probably. I mean, the reason Apple, for example, is such an astonishing company is not because it has a great design team, although it does. It is because it has mastered a very difficult social and organizational and managerial task of not only designing this stuff, but delivering it on time at colossal scale. And most of that is done by human beings who are not using scientific knowledge. They're not applying scientific knowledge. They're applying all kinds of managerial knowledge, of craft knowledge, of design knowledge, and all kinds of other things. And that, so in technology itself, it seems to me, is in fact a social process. But most of that gets drained out in the normal narrative about it. It's about wristbands. It's about kit. It's about.
Yeah. I mean, we've talked about the fact that the narrative focuses on the new and innovations and the point at which a new app is produced or something new is produced, as if that is the end of the process. And one of the things we know from all our work on technology is that's only one very small part of the process. And I mean, I've been quite interested in a growing literature on what's known as digital labour, where people are sort of talking about the fact, well, okay, it's one thing to invent things, but we know then there's a whole process by which the things are adapted, people integrate them into their homes, there's a lot of repair work to keep it going, there's a lot of updating of software, there's all this infrastructural work that goes on actually to keep the technical world going, but it's sort of invisible, and actually that work is very time consuming actually. You know, it's a lot. I mean, you know, if you talk to people about their lives, they'll say, oh, you know, you get a new machine, you've got to upload this stuff, you know, there's all this time to keep this going. But all one hears about is the sort of heroic inventor at the beginning. So it's a very skewed version of what technology is. But also I think that this obsession with the new, I don't know, maybe this is a long historical thing, is it as well, that we've always been obsessed with the new. But it seems to me that the obsession with the new and novelty, I mean, what is new, I think, is that the inbuilt obsolescence, the turnover is hugely accelerated. I think that's true. Because I can remember I started working on mobile phones when they first came out. And I remember thinking, gosh, it's astounding that people are changing their phones every 6 months. That this seemed to be an incredibly quick turnover of product compared to the technologies, like domestic technologies that I'd studied previously. And now it seems this has ratcheted up even more, that there is a business about the inbuilt obsolescence being accelerated. But also I think, just to sort of move on to sort of the instantaneity of consumption, that the whole business about being able to order things, you know, the instant gratification of, pushing a button and that you can order something in a second and that the drones will deliver it in a second, and that the intoxication of that kind of speed does seem to me to be sort of shifted, actually, the sort of satisfying of need, of so-called needs, the produced needs.
Well, it's instant gratification. I mean, you see that in the new kind of Uber-type services that are also beginning to emerge. What I wanted to go back to was the question about the different kinds of forces that you see that you talk about in the book, which are driving the problematic that we're now experiencing and that you write about. I think at one point you used that taxonomy, was it developed by Rosa? Mm-hmm. Where he talks about technological acceleration having something to do with speeding up of communications, transport, and production, and then social change of various kinds, and then the pace of life in terms of the way we live it, and what that suggests to me is that there is the technology bit of this is actually quite small, which is in a sense what comes out of your book. I mean, what you're saying is that the changing perception of time is partly driven by technological changes, but I think you're arguing that it's more driven by social change, by ideas about parenting, by changes in work patterns, and by other forces. Is that right?
Well, I'm doing yes and no. I'm wanting to sort of have it both ways. I mean, what I was trying to say with the Rosa discussion, which is the discussion about the paradox between the fact that on the one hand, technologies allow you to do things more quickly. So why don't you then feel like you've got more time? That would be the sort of logical sort of conclusion of that. And so I sort of try and deconstruct that and say, well, actually, that's a very simple model of the impact of technology on things. And actually, we all know that technology doesn't just speed up things that were already there, that technology actually always brings with it new kinds of activities, new social relations, new ways of doing things. I mean, I used to use the example in the old days of the washing machine, that given the washing machine is so efficient, how come people don't just wash, how come the time people spend doing laundry hasn't reduced as much as you would think? And the reason it hasn't is because people's standards of laundry have incredibly increased, so that even though most of us do white collar work and most of our clothes are pretty clean, we wash an incredible amount compared to what we used to. So actually what laundry is, what the activity is, how clothes are now designed, how our standards completely shift with new technologies. And I think that's the same with these information technologies.
Yep.
So it isn't just a simple saving of time, because actually we're doing a whole heap of things that we weren't doing before. So I'm trying to do both things in the book, actually. Say that actually technology is producing new things, and that a lot of these things we want, like connectivity, and maybe we can sort of come back to that, the pros and cons of hyperconnectivity. But I'm also saying that actually there's a lot of other things that are going on that sociologists would talk about, sort of structural changes in working patterns, in dual of families, in the intensification in parenting. Lots of other social changes are going on that may make us feel busy, that actually have got very little to do with technology themselves, but are whole sets of things that we may want to do now because we're living in a different kind of society. So just to sort of elaborate on that for a moment, I mean, again, within sociology, we talk about us shifting to a desynchronized or deroutinized society. And what we're trying to capture with that idea is that we've shifted from a sort of 9-to-5 working pattern of single, of nuclear families to a much more complicated labour market, which employers talk about as a flexible, wonderful labour market. It's a good thing for some people. It's actually a very bad 0 hours contract for other people, but it's a very different labour market than it used to be. Shops are open 24/7. Most families now have got 2 earners in them. So all of the kind of coordination, synchronization activities are much more complicated than they were in the 50s and 60s. And, when I started studying the mobile phone, and I was very slow in getting a mobile phone. I'm a real technophobe, actually, I have to say. I quickly understood that mobile phones had come into their own when people were just ringing from the supermarket saying, what'll I pick up for supper, and I'm on the train and I'm on the bus, and all these things that seem very trivial, but are all about coordinating very disorganised lives.
But those changes you've just described are actually huge changes in
Yes.
society. And in that sense, if you were to plot where technology belongs in that, it'd be a rather small blob.
Well, it's symbiotic, though. That's what I'm trying to say, that you can't understand how the mobile phone becomes ubiquitous, how it diffuses more quickly than any other technology in human history. So people claim. I never know about these claims. But, you know, you can only understand it alongside and in interaction with, in relation to, it seems to me, all these other changes that are going on. That's my point. And you know, when we did the old social shaping book all those years ago, 30 years ago, we talked a lot about, used the metaphor of mutual shaping to try and get across the sort of interrelationship really between technological changes on the one hand and social changes on the other. And it seemed to me if society wasn't changing, perhaps the phone wouldn't have spread, diffused at that rate, you know, that you could only understand the things in relation to each other. That's what I was trying to get across.
Yeah. Like it's kind of systemic.
Yes.
As we engineers would say. You know,
Right, yes.
Okay. But I think the washing machine example is interesting. How many people here find themselves struggling to keep up with email? Okay. Well, that's very interesting because I'm that book too, and I have 75,000 emails in my inbox or something. But the point I was trying to get at is that if you're a conscientious kind of academic working in university or whatever, then the institution in general works with email still. That doesn't apply to students, I see, but because my kids never use email, for example. But we have to, in academics do, in academic institutions. And you know the problem, which is that if you're good at dealing with your email, if you're very conscientious at dealing with it, well, guess what? Your email load goes up. So on the one hand, it is a very efficient sort of technology for enabling us to do our work, to coordinate our research activities, and so on and so forth. If you're really good at email, then you find you get an awful lot of email. So it doesn't. It appears to be a productive technology, and yet at the same time, it's an enslaving technology. And then you have the other interesting thing. How many of you use Apple computers? Okay. When Apple, have you noticed the way in which Apple helpfully updates your operating system at regular intervals? And are you universally delighted when that happens? Right, okay. And do you feel sometimes that perhaps you're not in charge of your life, but Apple is with this? I mean, it's very good technology and so on and so forth, and it's important to update operating systems to protect against viruses and close security holes and all the rest of it. That's absolutely true. But actually, every time my operating system gets updated, it's a kind of pain in the ass because it breaks stuff, and then there's a problem. And this is imposed on me by the company that's providing the stuff that helps me. And then you go to the Apple store, and you look for things that might be helpful. And what you notice is that everything that's connected with your work is labeled productivity. That's the category they use on the App Store. Everything that you might use for anything that is connected with trying to make your life easier or better, it's not labeled that way. It's labeled, everything is labeled as productivity. And that goes back to the kind of dominant narrative, which is that somehow it's all about work, and it's all about increasing your, quotes, productivity in a way that economists understand, but no normal human being does.
I mean, there's heaps to say about email.
Well, say something.
I don't know.
Say something.
All right, let me say a few things about email. I mean, one of the studies I report on in the book is a study by some Stanford colleagues of mine who've done a lot of work on email, and they very much argue that email has now become symbolic of overwork, that what you find actually is that that people feel overworked for a whole lot of reasons, that there aren't enough workers, that they've got too much work, that there are too many meetings, all of these sort of things, but that somehow getting back to the email at the end of the day, because it accumulates while you're away, becomes the symbolic story of what overwork is. and that somehow it's become the acceptable way to complain about overwork. I mean, actually, I was interested to see just a few weeks ago, there was one of these big Pew American surveys on email, where people do say that they're more productive with email. I mean, they don't say, you know, they say, actually, it is a pain, but it increases productivity. So it seems to me the email thing is a complicated thing. And I think one thing is its symbolic resonance, what it's come to mean. I think the other thing to always remember is that we have together agreed to norms of very quick responsiveness. You know, we have together agreed to that. We can together agree to shift a culture and say, like, you know, the Daimler car factory, you know, during vacations, we're not going to have emails collectively, or at the weekend, we're not going to have emails. And there's nothing, I mean, it's a good example of, you know, thinking, oh, well, the email speeds us up because data transmission is fast. Well, you know, however fast it goes, it doesn't mean you have to reply immediately. And I also think it's a good example of how we respond to technologies that are relatively new, just to go back to that point about the old and the new. I mean, actually, if you think in a bit the longer term, you know, email is still a relatively new phenomenon. And I mean, even since we've been using email, I think if you think about back to even your own practices, you now think about email in a different way than you did when you originally had it. You know, the excitement of the speed that I remember when, you know, it was first new and you could respond immediately. You thought, wow, and you responded to everything really quickly. And now actually, if you know, both in terms of our practices, but I mean, I've done some company studies, and I mean, within companies now, people build up behavioural patterns where, you know, they'll use email for some things and the mobile for some things and the phone, you know, landline for some things, and will get up from their desks and talk to people for other things. And there's quite intricate cultural norms and patterns developing over time, I think, within organisations about how to use these technologies. So I think they are always social and fundamentally cultural technologies, actually, even something like email.
Yep. I've got a friend who has a signature line on the bottom of his email now, which says, "For your comfort and safety, this email has been read and stored by the NSA."
I got a similar thing.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
That leads on to this puzzle that you mentioned at the beginning, which is Keynes's puzzle. You remember when he wrote about what was likely to happen when we had a more productive society where productivity was high enough to provide enough resource for everybody to work, to have a reasonable way of life, working for 3 hours a day or something. And I recently heard that one of the an interview where one of the Google co-founders, had discovered Keynes and thought this is a really good thing because Google is heavy into robotics, and in due course, you know, Keynes's vision will come about.
And I've also discovered that reading books is a good thing. I read recently.
Oh yeah, right. Well, there you go. but when he talked about a world dominated, which advanced robotics, built and controlled by Google, say, would be an unparalleled blessing for humanity, I began to wonder what he was smoking, because these guys don't believe that stuff, in my opinion. So there's a very strange world, but it hasn't happened, and it's not likely to happen given the way we respond to technology. Is that right? You know, like we have all this technology for making things smarter, and we supposedly feel short of time.
Well, I mean, again, where can I start with that story? Well, two important things to say about that. I mean, one is that the distribution of work, as you know, is very uneven. And one of the things I talk about in the book is the polarization of working hours. So on the one hand, there are people, and, you know, many people here, who work very long hours, and there are lots of people who are unemployed, who work zero-only contracts, who work part-time, who don't have enough work. So, you know, one huge issue is the distribution of work, and a more equal and just distribution of work, as opposed to the polarization of the labour market. It seems to me that we've got now. I mean, the other sort of issue, which is sort of an endless debate, and actually, you know, this will take us on to the question of how things are represented in the popular press, actually. I mean, there's endless discussions about the book, The Second Industrial Divide. I've just seen more discussions than I can imagine. You know, on Radio 4, there's a debate they tell me sold out about whether all the jobs are going to disappear and robots will do everything, and so it's this notion of this sort of jobless society. And actually, when you actually I heard interviews with the guys who wrote the second industrial divide. I mean, they are very clear that it isn't just that the technology is going in some direction. I mean, they're clear about the fact that actually they don't know. And the debate, as usual, is polarised between groups of people who say, well, if you look at the shift from agriculture to manufacturing, to the service sector, we've been through great technological revolutions before, and a whole lot of new jobs were created. And so it wasn't a long-term problem. And then there are people on the other side who say, oh no, this is different. This is a really new thing. The automation is completely a different thing. And we really are going to be left without work. I mean, nobody knows actually. Nobody knows about this. But what is very clear is that it's not as if this is just inevitably going to happen. That decisions are being made about which directions automation and technological development is going in, what sort of jobs are being automated, what sort of things we want to do. There's lots of caring labour. There's lots of labour that we need doing, and there aren't enough people to do them. And there's an issue about legislation and all sorts of decisions about this. And it seems to me that the discussion, again, goes back to what I was saying before, which is that, well, there's an inevitable automation of various things, as if things aren't being designed by people in particular contexts for particular purposes. And it may be a good thing to get rid of some unskilled work, like in car factories, spraying paint and various things like that. But whether we want nurse bots looking after old people, which is part of the trajectory, whether we want caring labour automated, whether we want software agents that will chat to us and say, how are you feeling today, Jude, and pretend that they're responding to me. I mean, these are all decisions that we as a society have got to make in terms of where we're going to put our research and development effort.
Yes, but there's something missing there. We as a society have got to make. The answer is that these are political issues,
yes,
which are not being discussed in our society at the moment, because we are living in democracies whose ruling elites appear to have been captured by a kind of neoliberal view of the world. So if we're going to have a world like that, in which machines are more dominant than they are now, and there's some very good work in Oxford which suggests that we should take seriously the case that advanced robotics are going to have a different kind of impact from the robotics of the past. And even if you don't buy into the hyperbole about that, nevertheless, we have coming up somewhere along the line, as societies, we have to make a choice. And societies can only make choices by using politics. And our politics doesn't have any of that in it at the moment, as far as I can see. This subject, for example, doesn't figure at all in a current election campaign here. It doesn't figure at all in the United States. So somewhere along the line, there's going to have to be political discussions about this stuff and political decisions, or there's just going to be the kind of technological deterministic rollover.
Well, I think that's true, but I mean, there's several things about this. I mean, why I got into this work in the first place was to educate engineers, actually, and I still think that that's a very important thing to do, to educate engineers and computer scientists and all the people who do this work about the fact that technologies are political. They're inherently political. That was the sort of point of the project originally. I'm still engaged in that project. I've still been trying to get more women into engineering. Boy, have I failed in the last 30 years. Apparently in Britain, 7% of professional engineers are women. So, not a good political victory on that one. But there is an issue, I think, about making engineering much more representative of social groups in society and making engineering a much more socially aware discipline. And I mean, if we go back 30 years, we can remember when there were movements for the social responsibility of scientists, that there was a lot of discussion about this, and there's no reason why we can't have that discussion again. But I mean, I'm also a bit hopeful because I have been speaking to some engineers about a movement towards responsible innovation, and I gather that the European Engineering Research Council have adopted as one of their criteria for funding things some notion of responsible engineering and trying to think through different avenues and discussions about engineering. I mean, you know, having said that, there is there's also, of course, the politics of consumers, which I think is limited, but there are quite a lot of movements about demanding technologies are more repairable. I mean, in fact, I read in The Guardian yesterday that there's some French legislation. Did you see this? There's a little piece about some new French legislation where companies will have to say how long their domestic products will last. You know, I mean, they're trying to legislate against inbuilt obsolescence. And I remember going to a conference actually years ago that was run by the engineers in London that was actually about getting Siemens and all of these companies to take responsibility for the rubbish, you know, for recycling and for all these things. So, you know, there are little patches of movement going on. There is sort of the makers culture, repair culture. So we've got to get all, you know, somehow got to organise these things together. I mean, when you say there's nothing happening at government level, I mean, there have been, you know, there's been quite a lot of expert committees on genetic tomatoes, on in vitro fertilisation. There's just been a whole thing in the Lords. I mean, there are quite a lot of discussion about these things. I think part of the limit of the discussions, or part of where they get, how they get narrowed, is it becomes a discussion about ethics. What's the sort of ethics involved in the direction of some of these things, having three parents of a child, that sort of discussion, rather than actually square on discussing these things as political. You know, that big data is political, the way you collect it is political, the algorithms are political, you know, and the outcomes are going to be in some directions or another. And I think that's very hard to get across. And, you know, one of the things I talk about in the book is even things like search engines, you know, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure everyone here thinks about search engines and think about what knowledge you're getting and what knowledge aren't you getting. And, you know, those creeps at Google will never tell us what the algorithm is, so we're never going to actually know how they organise what they call universal knowledge and information. You know, so those discussions, I think we're having a bit more of those discussions, actually.
Well, if you think about the Google case is interesting, especially the European Court judgment about the quote's right to be forgotten, because it isn't the right to be forgotten, it's the right not to be found by Google's search engine. Okay, that's what it is, because the stuff remains on the net wherever it was before Google found it. But implicit in that is an idea, which is that in a network world, if Google doesn't find you, then you don't exist. Now, that suggests that Google, a corporation, has acquired a new kind of power that we've never had before, and we don't even have a way of conceptualizing it. The standard response is, well, actually there are other search engines are available, and so on, and the costs for a consumer of switching from Google to Bing or to DuckDuckGo or whatever is minimal. So it's not like a traditional monopoly of the old kind. Nevertheless, it seems to me that represents significant levels of power in a network world, and we don't have any way of talking about that.
I completely agree with you, and we're only starting to have that conversation, and I think it's a very important conversation. I mean, I have been to some conferences recently on, you know, they call it digital labour just for short, but trying to talk about the tracking technologies and what the tracking means and who owns the information and whether we should feel relaxed about the fact that we are producing all this information that is then monetised by these companies. And I was quite interested to see a piece by Morozov in New Left Review, the latest New Left Review, where he at least puts on the agenda a discussion about whether we should charge for this data, you know, not give this data away for free. It's our data, that we could have different ways of organising this where, you know, we make money from it or we don't allow the data to be given away freely. I mean, you're right, we're only beginning to discuss it, but I think we are starting to have discussions about that. And I mean, I'm sure in this place, there are many students working on exactly these issues.
Yep. And maybe we should stop at that point and open it up. Please, say something. Down at the back.
Of course. I had tons of different questions, but you know, the one that I kind of started with when I was thinking about this and that I ended with, the more I heard from you, is, here's just a critique that I want to give, and then I'd like for you to throw something back to me, if possible. I don't appreciate the characterization of the employees at Google. I've been to the Plex and they seem kind of happy. They don't seem miserably overworked, and they're not all white men. Some are Asian men.
Yep. Yep.
It's a different issue, Bernie.
You know, where that discussion needs to be lifted out is not where it was being taken. And I think that as sociologists, we need to understand our material. And in this case, we need to understand what machine learning means and what it means for our work. Because the logic, the ideology of computer science will transcend the classes of race and gender and religion, and we have everybody's equal and fair. Those ideologies will still persist, and it is those ideologies that are driving a lot of the ideas here. And the key one, as I've seen from being around a lot of computer scientists, is the absolute tyranny of marginal cost. The idea is that at any point, whatever we can do to minimize marginal costs, minimize repetition, minimize the human having to do anything, and front load it all into the fixed cost, we'll build it into the system. You know, I say computer scientists, you never ask a computer scientist for a glass of milk, because he'll build you a barn and fill it with cows just to make the second glass that much easier. And this ideology will persist, and it is that ideology that I think is individualizing us in order to create systems where this marginal cost is minimized, but in doing so, totally reorganize a lot of our approaches to the things that we were doing otherwise. It has to fragment our time and fragment our activities in order to make them sufficiently small in order to be atomized in this machine learning framework. And so I would like to hear a little more about what are the ideologies that are driving the technological producers. We say they're political, but obviously, you know, sociologists would say obviously they're political, but what are their politics?
Well,
Do you want to have a go at that?
what?
I've got things to say too. So you
I've
go
got
first.
many things to say about that, but you're sort of asking it's slightly two different things. I mean, I didn't quite understand the first point. I mean, it is accurate to say that on the whole, they are young men, and it is accurate to say, and Jesse Jackson has recently been raising the fact that I think 1% are Black Americans, for example. Yeah. So it's a very young, specific group of people who've got very limited experience, right? And it's not a profound thing to go from that to say, well, people can only make things that reflect their own experience. That is logical, and so it would be good to have a wider representation of people involved in this work because they might think about different things to make. So that's one thing. Now the second thing is, huh?
I think that is necessary but not sufficient.
No, I know. So I'm going on to the second thing. The second thing is that what are they about? I mean, the ties with the military are very strong. They always were historically. They still are. And the motive is profit. You know, they're private sector companies that are trying to make a lot of money, and speed makes a lot of money. And certainly it is very hard at the moment to make a case for big state-funded projects, that aren't military. I mean, obviously the military is the sort of state, yes? But I mean, actually across Europe there are some big projects, and that I think, where is the what's the direction of the innovation? You know, is the innovation for more apps and more iMacs, or for alternative energy? You know, it's how do we shift the sort of priorities of the research and development? That's what I'm trying to get at, and away from, as you say, that particular mindset of sort of automating things and thinking of things in that very linear way, and that's difficult. But anyway, I'll turn to Mike.
Thank you for the question, because I think, I mean, there's no mileage in demonizing employees of Google. I accept that. I know quite a lot of them, and I know quite a lot about Google, and I played host for 4 days once to the chairman of the company, so I know quite a lot about it, and I see them a lot. But what one notices and it's not just Google, but in the whole of that technology community, you see some commonalities. First of all, they are all technocrats, broadly speaking. They think the world as we live it, the world that we have arranged through our politics and other, is simply crazy. It's illogical. It's run by half-wits who can't think things through, who don't think systemically and all the rest of it. And if Google organised it, it would be a better, more rational, logical place. That's fine. They're entitled to that view, and but that's a definite, very strong mindset that you see right through the whole culture. But more importantly, they are masters of a particular kind of technology, and I think digital technology is interestingly different from the technologies that were dominant before, because it has four separate and important affordances. One of which you've mentioned, which is it basically is a zero marginal cost or near zero marginal cost technology. First of all, so once you build the thing, whatever it is, then the next pint is almost free. Like that. Okay, that's the first bit of it. Second one is that the technology exploits to an extraordinary degree the power of network effects. And again, we've seen that. That's why there'll never be another Facebook, let's say. Okay. The third thing is that, as far as we can see, in areas where this technology is deployed, there are no normal distributions at all. There are only power law distributions, which means that small agents, a small minority of agencies, whether they're sites, whether they're corporations, or whether they get most of the action and everybody else is down in the long tail. And the fourth thing is that in some cases they are dominated also by technological lock-in. It varies from which part of the thing you're looking at them. But for example, at the moment, it used to be Microsoft many years ago. Most of you are too young to remember Microsoft, but it was a famous company once, with a 95% kind of monopoly grip on its market. But at the moment, probably the technological lock-in that really matters is Amazon's API for its cloud services. Okay, that's at the moment, and that will change again. Now, the point is that the technology has these special characteristics. Those special characteristics point in one direction, and the direction is towards monopolistic control of whatever it is. That's where they point. So one question we might have for our politics in the long run is, given that one of the functions of governments in liberal democracies is to protect citizens against the depredations of monopolistic corporations, the question is, will we one day have to shoulder the burden of protecting citizens against the depredations of companies that dominate technology with network effects? Okay, maybe not, but so that's the first. The second thing that's also obvious in terms of your useful characterization of the way in which people in these industries think is you try and not only do you try and exploit zero marginal cost, but the other thing is really interesting one. You get the customer to do the work. Okay, all the content on Facebook is created by you and me, and we're not paid for it. All the wealth that accumulates from that particular enterprise goes to the shareholders. It doesn't go to anybody who works on it. So we are effectively digital sharecropping is what is a business model for this industry, and that's baked into it as well. And so far we have no way of dealing with it. We just go on and accept it. That's a rant, not an answer to your question, but it'll do.
Good.
Thank you.
Yeah, I guess I want to go back to the time issue just a little bit here. And you talked at one point, Judy, about the way in which mobile phones get replaced at very high rates. I'm wondering if we think about that historically. When I was young, I had neighbors who got a new car every year. And this was sort of, for many people, this was a cultural ideal. If you could do it, you bought a new car every year, so you'd arrived. I don't think anyone does that anymore.
Yeah.
In fact, one of the characteristics of cars, they've become a lot more reliable. And a 10-year-old car with 150,000 miles on it is not at all unusual to be available. So, and I think you can see that in PCs, even to take a more digital example. One of the reasons PC companies have been running into trouble is the replacement cycle is slowing down as computers become more reliable, as the technology itself becomes slower in its change. And so I'm wondering if some of the sort of frenetic pace of phones is just due to an affordance of a particular stage in the adoption curve of technology.
I mean, that's an interesting question, but isn't it about, I mean, you know, the Apple phenomenon I find extraordinary, and when I think about that, I think it's about a lifestyle, that it actually isn't about the technology. I mean, and actually, but you're saying that in terms of the car, that it was about status.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it seems to me that the Apple, that getting the latest iPad, is so bound up with people's identity now, and style and presentation and performance of self, that they're very clever, Apple, I think, in making the transition from, I mean, a technology is never just a technology, but it's so embedded now with identity meaning. It's so part of cool and style and what you are. I mean, you know, I go to cafes a lot in London. I'm sure it's the same here. And every cafe you go into, everyone's got their Apple. They're sitting there with their Apple, and it is like a statement about who you are. So I think you know, what we used to talk about in the old day of the production of desire, you know, as Marcuse talked about perfectly well, you know, 30, 40 years ago, that how good capitalism was at producing new desires, new needs. I think the way that's now embedded in cultural identity is it's somehow never been so strong, the business about the updating. So I don't know if, I mean, the updates are trivial. I mean, if you look at the iPads, you know, the Apple things, I mean, they're really incredibly trivial. We don't use anything like the capacity of these machines.
Just to go back, it's a very interesting question, because it illustrates it illustrates the fact how difficult it is to escape from the sociology of the last 5 minutes, which is what we're dealing with in all of this stuff. I mean, Judy and I feel that a lot, because I write a newspaper column. And the temptation always is, the pressure is always to be obsessed with what's happening now and not take the longer view. And for example, in relation to automobile ownership, we know that young people who live in cities don't like having cars anymore. So it is changing. And perhaps, you know, when we look back on this period from the perspective of 50 years from now, we'll see a similar effect. It's just that it's very hard to perceive it because we're obsessed with the now.
Right. I mean, I would say, you know, cars were also part of people's identity. I mean, really
Yeah.
They
fundamental.
were,
And I grew up with people who'd spend their entire weekend working on their car, every single weekend. And let me just point out also that Vance Packard was writing The Status Seekers in the late 1950s as well, as far as brand loyalty is concerned.
Yeah. Okay. I'll go to you. You first.
Oh, okay. I'd like to mirror Grant's point and push back pretty hard on that. I think that we're still in a place where things like iPads are functionally changing a lot generation to generation. We haven't locked in the way Toyota locked in cars yet. But no, I'm really curious about part of your thesis here about kind of it being common wisdom that everything is moving quickly. And you said a bit of it about the press. And when I think about how refreshing your book is, I think about the last 7 books I was asked to comment on about digital dementia and other neologisms like this. And I'm just curious about what role do you see academics and the press playing in kind of feeding this monster?
Well, I think I'm sorry that there aren't more journalists, you know, writing critical pieces, actually. I mean, I think and I'd love you to comment on this. I mean, what I'm very much struck by in the last couple of decades is how technology is news in a way that it wasn't before. Just going back to the old advertising, you know, I remember where there were advertisements and you knew they were advertisements when a new product came in. And I can't remember when it was that even good, high-quality newspapers literally had on the front page when a new Apple was produced, that actually the news is now full of what are in fact ads, you know, and that there's been a complete, that whole boundary between the ads, I think in technology writing, the boundary between news and ads, I mean, they don't even have to pay. You know, Coca-Cola used to have to pay a lot of money to have ads. I mean, Apple doesn't have to do that. These technologies don't have to do that. And I think that is a relatively new phenomenon, that merging. So that's sort of one thing. And of course, all those stories then are actually ads and just pushing products. And, you know, I mean, if you think about the driverless car or any of these things, I mean, it is just extraordinary how one can't get away from these things. And what's, what is really pernicious about it, I think, is that actually, one of the things, again, we talk about, we sociologists in technology studies, is about socio-technical imaginaries. Yeah, how do we imagine the future? How do we think about what are possible? And that these technology companies take up this space by imagining for us a future of a driverless car, a future of a nurse bot, always predicting the future. And that sort of performing of the future is their attempt to make the future and create markets. I mean, they want to make a future in which their products will sell. And so they're endlessly sort of producing the future for us. And it's very difficult in that context to break through and try and sort of critique that. So, I mean, as an academic, I'm trying to slice that. And I wish there were sort of more journalists sort of trying to do that. Because I don't know why it is that even the good journalists on the whole do endlessly fall into this. Utopia, dystopia, everything's changed, nothing's changed. It somehow is so hard to write anything a bit more subtle, even in longer pieces.
Well, there are two aspects of it. One is that the discourse is impoverished because it's Manichaean. It's either dystopia or utopia. And in that sense, and the truth is that we have this stuff, we have invented it, we are not going to uninvent it, and it has created for us a different and rather problematic world. And that's the reality. So for us to be talking, for the media, for example, to be oscillating between these two Manichaean extremes of it's dystopia or utopia it's absurd as imagining fish discussing whether water is a good idea or not. Okay, it's the reality we live in. Now, in terms of journalism, I think one should never underestimate the aphrodisiac effect of money. I mean, people used to be, or power, but my feeling about the journalistic community is that, broadly speaking, it's lost its marbles in this area. Partly because most journalists are non-techie. They think this stuff is magic, and they don't have any idea how it works. I've been a writer on the Observer for longer than I care to admit, an awful long time, and for many years I was the only person on the Observer who actually understood how any of this stuff worked, and I had to keep that quiet. Because if I had revealed that I'd had an email address when in the 1970s when I was a student at Cambridge, I would have been regarded as one of those guys with bottle ends for his spectacles, a boffin. So there's a cultural thing in Britain about that. In America, I think it's largely the worship of power and money. But in each case, you find journalists have just checked their brains in at the door in covering this stuff. And then you have somebody like Steve Jobs, a messianic kind of genius, and you find that, for example, a press conference organised by a technology company becomes a bigger deal from a news point of view than the President of the United States declaring war. I mean, it's just mad, but it has happened. And what I find in writing my column is that I'm lucky to write for a newspaper where at least some people have retained their marbles, and where I can say, when somebody says to me, "Has Apple peaked?" I say, actually, I couldn't give a monkey's. And I can get away with it. But in many newspapers, you couldn't do that. So there's a lot to be said in terms of criticism of our media. They've just lost it. But there's a more powerful dynamic going on in our society generally, because our governments are worshipping this stuff too.
I mean, I must say, when The Guardian announced it was doing that Tech Monthly magazine, I was terribly excited. I thought, oh, great, he'll be a really sort of good resource. And I hope you've got nothing to do with that. No, thank goodness. I just thought, because actually, I've been so disappointed with it. I mean, I don't know, you probably all read it, but you just open it up and it's just ads and new this and new that, a new app, and I mean, it's really shocking given it's The Guardian and what they could be putting in there. And people then rely on blogs and, don't they, and to try and find some sort of critical literature and actually in other places.
Yep.
Thank you.
Helen, sorry.
I just wanted to. Just wanted to ask whether you, in the book, do you talk about the kind of, well, I think Bernie alluded to it. I mean, the kind of tiny packets of time, the effect of tiny packets of time, because surely that's one thing that technology does. It gives you these possibility of these kind of micro acts. And I mean, it seems to me that there's a couple of quite profound effects which are actually good, just to be not utopian, but headed on that side of things for the moment. I mean, in my field, in the field of politics, I believe that is causing a kind of upsurge in political activity, because there are political acts that become possible where the transaction costs have just fallen so much that people are doing them, whereas before they wouldn't. So, you know, you can give £1 to something, or you can click like, or sign an electronic petition, and these are tiny acts which people just weren't doing before, and I think it's drawing great swathes of people into the political process, which is really quite exciting. I mean, there's all sorts of issues about that, and as a political scientist, I think about them a lot. But you know, it's precisely that, the kind of dividing time up into these little packets. And the other thing is the point you made about de-routinization. I mean, which is surely a very profound social shift. I mean, apparently the average family doesn't now decide what they're going to have. It won't be decided what they're going to have for dinner until 4 o'clock. And speaking as someone who still hasn't decided, and it's now 6:15, I'm very much attuned to that way of thinking. But surely it's the little packets. I mean, you talked about looking after children, and it's the little packet effect there that is having the effect, isn't it? I mean, anyone who's looked after a small child knows that you absolutely can't go and write a long letter, and probably not a long email, depending on the age of the child. But you can send a text and tell somebody to do something, or arrange something. And that's what's allowing, that's the mechanism by which the de-routinization is happening, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you and with everything you've said, and I think it's a much better way of thinking about it than multitasking. And you know what I do talk
exactly.
about.
People give multitasking, but the fact is, people are doing a load of stuff that they weren't doing before. And frankly, I mean, my life would be completely non-viable without it.
And mine. And mine. I'm a multitasker with the wrong algorithm. My engineering colleagues say, well, we can reflash you, but anyway.
No, I mean, I completely agree with you, and I think there's been much too much focus on multitasking, and I do look at what's been written about that, and of course what comes out is that people aren't multitasking, they're doing things in quick sequences, just as you've sort of described. I mean, you know, what's interesting is that people aren't deciding what they're going to eat until that time, but in fact, the family meal in the evening is still quite common, that you would think that this is all gone, but actually it hasn't gone. And I think a lot of those spaces are filled in very productive ways, and I think that's very good. I mean, I went to this panel on Saturday, actually, that was talking about young people and identity in the internet. And, you know, Sonia Livingston, who knows a lot about this, was countering some of these ideas and saying, look, actually, I used to be very bored as a kid, you know, like all this time that you're talking about where you're assuming before it was great being a child and now it's terrible because you're stuck on a machine. Actually, isn't it fantastic that kids can do all these things now when they might have been bored on a long journey, you know? So, I mean, I agree.
Well, exactly. Yes. And quite often when the kids are doing that, the parent is probably doing something they wouldn't otherwise, I mean, something useful.
Yes, but
they wouldn't otherwise
Well,
be
just to
doing.
give an example, which is, to my astonishment, I read a lot of books on Kindle books on my iPhone. And I never thought that would happen. And the reason is that I'm often in places where I'm waiting for something to happen, or I'm collecting somebody from school or whatever. And I've got 5 minutes, and there it is. I read Thomas Piketty's book on my iPhone. I never realised I could get through some of it. Yeah. So there are odd affordances which are
that
really
is
good,
really, God, wow.
And that is because you've been able to make that little bit of time, which you wouldn't have been able to do. The transaction costs of having the book there at that moment would have been too great.
That's right. I wouldn't carry Thomas Piketty's book round with me, just in case I had a few minutes to read. Nor would you either, by the way. Sorry. Anybody?
No, I agree. Yeah.
So I'm really interested in the issue of engineers. You were talking about how we need more women, for example, more diverse engineers. So engineers have this really important role. What's new about that, or is there nothing new? Are the engineers of today like the experts of yesterday, or is there anything new about that?
Well, I think the character of engineering sort of hasn't changed enormously in terms of who's doing it. I mean, I agree with you that it's a particularly sort of British problem in terms of how engineering and some of these technical skills are seen. And, you know, I was just thinking in terms of the government. I mean, one of the things that's said about politicians, for example, is that there's very few scientists, very few engineers, that politics is full of lawyers, that we live in a sort of very odd culture in terms of how little expertise there, you know, that we're living in this very technological world, and yet the political expertise to deal with these things is very sort of light on the ground. So, you know, one of the things would be to sort of shift I think the culture of these things, to have, you know, rather than PPE being the great thing to do, have engineering as the great, you know, engineering and philosophy being the thing to do, and produce different kinds of engineers.
I'm trying to persuade Cambridge to put on a PPE course, which is politics, philosophy, and engineering. But
Do engineers have more power, though? I guess that was my question. Do they have more power now than engineers before, or what was their equivalent?
Well,
Is
I
that
think
something
well,
new?
I think they do, in the sense that the big companies that you know, that the power of the Silicon Valley companies is huge now. They're huge, rich conglomerates, and that these companies are basically engineering companies. So I think in that sense, it is something new, actually. And I mean, you know, I was just teaching a class this week on the sort of tracking technology. And I mean, you know, one of the things I think is new with the Snowden revelations is that the state is now dependent on private companies to get surveillance data, you know, and I sort of showed them a film of sort of East Germany and the Stasi collecting data, where you think of Big Brother state collecting data, and now you have a very different kind of data relationship between big corporations and the state. So I think those things are shifting, and I think the companies are incredibly powerful now.
Tom?
Thank you very much. Just two quite quick questions.
Oh yes.
Beware.
So I wonder if there's a false opposition going on. So you said absolutely rightly that you know, there's nothing inevitable about technology. We make it, so it's not inevitable. You know, we choose what it's going to be. But I suppose I wonder if there's the fear is something in between, which is that the choices we make are very substantially shaped by forces that we don't choose, and sometimes that's just pure market forces. So it's consumer pressures, and sometimes that's market-like forces which will lead to certain technologies coming into existence to satisfy our desires, and so there's nothing inevitable, but there's a kind of ineluctability about us being led towards a certain destination. And the worry in that situation is that the effective means for changing that tend to be state-led, and we just tend to get things wrong when we intervene with the state. So we're kind of we're caught between a rock of the free market and the hard place of excessive state intervention, and we're just trying to navigate that thing. So that's the first one. The second one on the time, I mean, this is just sort of unscientific personal reflection. Have you thought about how much commuting plays into our sense of press for time? Because particularly with the rise of two-income families, the difficulty of getting two jobs in the same place, increasingly it's going to be very rarely the case that one partner that both partners are employed in the place where they work. So inevitably you'll have two or maybe even three kind of locations that a couple's lives are in. And you've just got pure distance, you've just got time spent in travel, and the disruption of life that causes. So clearly that's partly possible in virtue of the communication, but other factors have led to that coming across. So
I mean, I agree with you actually on both points. With the second point, yes, I do discuss commuting time, and actually, you know, Paul Virilio, this French theorist of speed, has wonderful stuff on that, where he talks about, on the one hand you get faster and faster cars, on the other hand you get gridlock, you know, the whole business about more freeways, more gridlock. That it's one of the dialectical contradictions he talks about in terms of actually the speed of the car on the one hand, and the reality both of the time it takes because of the gridlock, but also, which I think is interesting, and maybe we sort of haven't talked about, the sort of sedentary nature of a lot of the speed, which I think he talks about in a very interesting way, that, you know, it's fast in the sense that the car's going fast, but actually sitting in a car or sitting in front of a computer screen is very sedentary, and that we don't often talk about that in terms of this acceleration society, the sedentary, the corporeal, sedentary nature of our lives in the speeded up society. So I agree with you about that. The first point you made is a social shaping point, absolutely, which is that we only get to choose from a very restricted range of technologies, that the choice is limited, and that's absolutely right. And on a good day, I will of course say, when I'm in that corner, that all technological innovations have unintended consequences, have unpredictable opportunities, and that we can point to the history of technology and see that for all that engineers and designers try and imprint and embed and inscript their technologies in particular ways, that people are very creative and that they use technologies in different ways, so that, you know, the phone was designed as a business tool, not to sit on the train and say, you know, I'm on the train. So you're right. We want to sort of do both things. I mean, there's a lot of unpredictability and creativity in terms of technology, but you're right that certain technologies, like military technologies, there's not a lot you can do with them, except it would appear that with drones maybe you can deliver pizzas, you know. But so yes, I think that's part of the analysis of the social shaping of technology, actually.
Just to pick up on, sorry.
And the lock-in issue is a big issue, and whether we're more and more locked into particular paths and directions.
I mean, you could argue, and I do argue, that the internet we've got is almost entirely socially shaped. If you think of it as having a 40-year life, starting from the research project in '73 after the ARPANET, for the first 20 years of its existence, the design phase to '83, and then from '83 to '93, it was the preserve of a very small elite group who had had a distinctive ethos. And the design of the net, the technical design of the net, for example, the SMTP protocol, was shaped by the fact that these people knew one another, trusted one another, broadly speaking, didn't see the need for authentication and so on. And you had the growth of Usenet News and the culture of very, very wide free speech, very wide unrestricted free speech of a different kind that had been possible before. And okay, so the first 20 years, that the network that emerged from the TCP/IP network as it emerged was shaped, I think, very largely by the social ethos of the people who developed it. Right? Then '93, you have the big browser, and suddenly the rednecked hordes of the world get into this space, and the next 20 years, the internet as it emerged from '93 onwards is effectively shaped by that. For example, the people who flooded into the internet after the web became mainstream were people who had a pathological aversion to paying for anything. Okay, they wanted online stuff, they really liked it, but didn't want to pay for it. So a business model had to evolve in order to make that possible, and the business model that evolved was surveillance. It's the Google model, the Facebook model, and all the things we've stuck with now. So you could say that we shaped, innocent, hapless, thoughtless consumers, shaped the network as it evolved into this monster that we have now. And in that sense, nobody made an individual choice. We made an aggregation of collective choices which shaped it.
Yeah.
So your book was kind of featured in a really quite good, I thought, article in The Economist. So I haven't read the book, but I think I'm really interested in the kind of neoliberalism of time. And obviously neoliberalism is a bit of a rascal concept, and it's very easy to chuck it out there and put it away. But so you mentioned the polarization of the labour market in terms of the hours undertaken, and certainly the article, this article is really saying that that's in part responsible for our time pressure. So the more you're paid and per hour, the more opportunity cost your leisure hours start to become, and our conception of time pressure is coming in part from our pressure of our leisure time and that opportunity cost there. So I think in terms of this speeding up and kind of flexible working, I'm thinking that there's a kind of neoliberalism there of commodifying extra time in your week, and that adding extra pressure. So those are just some thoughts, but really I think the question I wanted to ask was if these technologies had emerged under a kind of different economic paradigm, previously, or we don't know what's to come, do you think they'd have been different? Do you think those, we could have got a more kind of Keynesian, more leisure time attitude? Do you think that's specific to now, or is it a kind of dialectic? So actually the technologies are playing into that kind of commodification in and of themselves.
I mean, the Skadelskis wrote a book called, what's it called? More is Enough.
How much is enough?
How much is enough? Thank you very much. And I mean, they're very concerned. They set up the dilemma of the Keynesian thing and why we haven't got to a shorter working week. And one of the things clearly part of it is to do with, our form of capitalism and employers and the kind of choices, constrained choices people can have. But they do also talk about our conceptions of the good life and what our conception of the good life is. And I was very struck by this because I read a piece years ago by Jonathan Gershuni, who's a time use man who's here, called Busyness as a Badge of Honour, where he talks about, and I was sceptical, I have to say, when I read it, and it's not a new piece, but I more and more actually have come round to thinking that he had a very good point, that somehow our images that we're presented with of the rich and powerful are people whose lives are incredibly full. They work incredibly long hours and then they have incredibly intense leisure time, that there's intensity of both things, and that we have a sense that a good life is a life that is really packed with activities, and that a slow life is to be a failure. It's losers. It's a failure. And actually, I mean, at the talk where we were in Cambridge, somebody put up, Brendan, my friend, put up his hand and said, well, if I was to say to you all that if I go back to my office and there won't be any new emails there and I haven't got a lot to do, you'd really think I was some loser. That I do think our cultural valuation of what a good life is now very bound up with a hyper-connected, 24/7, busy culture, busy work, busy everything, and that we're living these technologies in that context. I mean, I listened on the radio last night, actually, on my iPlayer, which I'm really, together enough to manage, but there was a public radio, one of those American public radio programs on success, on the concept of success, and it's really worth listening to in terms of the hyper-work, rich conception of what success is. And even though they try and be a bit critical, in the end it comes down to money, power and hyperactivity. So yes, I do think that.
But in your book, you at one point, you have this concept for what actually constitutes the secret of a good life, I think. You call it temporal sovereignty.
Yeah.
Which means the ability to control your time. And I've always thought that that's the great privilege of being an academic, broadly speaking. That's one of the things that makes academic life rich, in a way that I know bankers, I know solicitors in London who take home £2.5 million a year, and I think they live a much poorer life than I do, in fact, because I have control of my day and they don't.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that's true in many other kind of areas of life as well. Should we stop?
That
Yes.
is a very perfect note.
To have some
An
leisure.
optimistic note. To have some leisure and enjoy a glass of wine. Thank you very much.